They told you some rifles were too old to remember how to live. They were wrong. The restoration bay inside the National Airborne Heritage Museum smelled of cold steel, walnut oil, and decades of careful preservation. Bright LED work lights poured across a workbench where history seemed to have surrendered at last. Resting on a padded cloth lay an original World War II M1A1 Paratrooper carbine, its folding stock scarred by time, its receiver dulled beneath layers of oxidation, its moving parts frozen in silent refusal. Around it stood 6 restoration specialists wearing spotless gray lab coats, each carrying years of certifications, digital scanners, and enough technical manuals to fill an entire archive. Every test had reached the same conclusion. The rifle was beyond saving. Ethan Brooks folded his arms and stared at the final diagnostic report glowing on a tablet. 40 years old, respected across the country's military museums, he hated admitting defeat, but facts were facts. The internal corrosion had spread too deeply, microscopic warping had altered the original tolerances, and multiple restoration attempts from previous decades had only made things worse. He slowly removed his safety glasses and sighed. "That's it," he said. "We preserve what's left. We don't force miracles." His words echoed softly through the workshop as the younger technicians exchanged disappointed looks. One of them carefully lifted a small brass plaque already engraved with the words "and unrestorable." It would soon sit beside the rifle inside a climate-controlled display case, another silent artifact that would never function again. Just as the plaque approached the display stand, an unfamiliar voice drifted across the room. Quiet. Calm. Almost gentle. It isn't dead. Every head turned. Standing just inside the open doorway was an elderly man wearing faded denim, worn leather boots, and an olive green field jacket whose elbows had been repaired more than once. His white hair rested neatly beneath a weathered baseball cap with no military insignia. In one hand he carried a small leather satchel darkened by age and polished smooth from decades of use. He didn't step forward. He simply looked at the carbine as though greeting an old friend. Ethan glanced toward the museum volunteer who had been escorting visitors earlier that morning. "Sir, this restoration area isn't open to the public." The old man nodded politely without taking his eyes off the rifle. "I know." His voice carried no irritation, only certainty. "I came because someone said she couldn't be brought back." Ethan forced a courteous smile, the kind professionals used when dealing with determined hobbyists. "We've already exhausted every approved procedure. 3 independent evaluations. Laser measurements. Metallurgical imaging. There's nothing left to repair." The old man remained silent for a long moment. His pale blue eyes traced the folded stock, the receiver, the charging handle, lingering on details no one else seemed to notice. Finally, he spoke again. "You aren't looking where she hurts." A faint chuckle escaped one of the younger technicians. Another quietly shook his head. Ethan exhaled and slipped the tablet under his arm. "With respect, sir, history isn't a repair manual." The old man's expression never changed. He tightened his grip on the old leather satchel and took one slow step toward the workbench. The room somehow felt quieter than before. Even the steady hum of the climate control system seemed to fade beneath the growing stillness. The brass plaque remained suspended above the display stand, waiting to declare that a piece of American history had reached the end of its story. The old veteran looked at the forgotten carbine for another heartbeat, then softly whispered words that no scanner, no database, and no modern certification could possibly understand. "Let's see if you still remember me." Thomas Walker stopped beside the workbench without asking for permission to come any closer. His attention never drifted toward the technicians or the expensive equipment surrounding them. Every ounce of his focus remained fixed on the old carbine. The silence stretched long enough to make several people uncomfortable. Ethan Brooks finally broke it. "Sir, I appreciate your passion, but this firearm has already been examined by experts from 3 preservation laboratories. Every recommendation reached the same conclusion." Thomas gave a small nod. "I believe them." The answer caught Ethan off guard. "Then you understand why we cannot risk any more damage." Thomas slowly placed his worn leather satchel on the edge of the table. The brass clasp clicked open with a familiar sound softened by countless years of use. Inside rested nothing remarkable at first glance. A clean cotton cloth. A small wooden-handled screwdriver darkened by age. A brass punch polished smooth from decades of careful handling. A tiny bottle containing pale amber oil with no commercial label. The younger technicians exchanged amused glances. Mason Reed folded his arms and quietly muttered, "That belongs in an antique store." A few restrained smiles appeared around the room. Thomas heard every word but offered no response. Instead, he looked toward Ethan. "May I ask one question?" Ethan hesitated before nodding. "Go ahead." Thomas pointed toward the folding stock. "How many times has it been disassembled since the war?" Ethan looked surprised. 7 documented restorations. Thomas tilted his head almost imperceptibly. There were 8. The room became still again. Ethan frowned. "There is no record of an 8th restoration." Thomas smiled gently. "That is because it was never written down." Before anyone could respond, he leaned slightly closer to the rifle without touching it. His pale blue eyes moved across the receiver, then paused near a tiny scratch hidden beneath the hinge of the folding stock. The mark was barely visible beneath decades of finish and careful cleaning. Thomas whispered almost to himself, "You are still there." Noah Carter, the youngest museum volunteer, stepped closer out of quiet curiosity. He followed the old veteran's gaze but saw nothing unusual. "What are you looking at?" he asked softly. Thomas did not answer immediately. Instead, he extended one weathered finger until it hovered a fraction of an inch above the tiny scratch. "Someone polished everything except this." Ethan glanced toward the hinge through a magnifying lamp. "That is only cosmetic wear." Thomas slowly shook his head. "No. It is a witness mark." Ethan looked puzzled. "A witness mark?" Thomas nodded. "A mechanic leaves one when he wants to know whether something has shifted after hard use. Not every lesson was printed in a manual." The technicians exchanged uncertain looks. Digital measurements, laser scans, and historical documentation had filled weeks of work, yet none of them had mentioned such a detail. Thomas finally looked up from the rifle and met Ethan's eyes for the first time. There was no pride in his expression, only quiet confidence earned over a lifetime. "You have been trying to restore what you can measure," he said calmly. "But this carbine stopped trusting measurements a very long time ago." Noah felt a strange chill despite the climate-controlled room. There was something about the old man's certainty that refused to sound like guesswork. It sounded like memory. Ethan remained unconvinced, but the confidence in his own conclusions had begun to fade by the smallest measure. He glanced once more at the forgotten scratch beneath the folding stock, wondering why none of them had questioned it before. Thomas rested one hand lightly on the edge of the workbench, but still did not touch the rifle itself. His fingers hovered patiently above the old walnut and steel as though waiting for permission that only history could grant. Thomas remained motionless until Ethan gave the smallest nod of reluctant permission. It was not trust. It was professional curiosity refusing to walk away. Without another word, Thomas reached toward the old carbine with hands that moved neither slowly nor quickly, but with the quiet confidence of someone greeting an old companion after many years apart. His fingertips settled gently against the worn walnut stock. The workshop disappeared from his eyes. The polished floor, the bright lights, the digital instruments all faded behind the familiar texture of old American walnut that had once carried rain, dust, cold mornings, and endless miles. His thumb drifted across the tiny witness mark beneath the folding hinge. The instant his skin met the scar, his breathing paused almost imperceptibly. The soft hum of climate control dissolved into the distant rustle of canvas. Parachutes swaying in an autumn breeze. He was no longer an elderly visitor standing inside a museum. He was a young paratrooper mechanic barely 20 years old, standing beside a rough wooden workbench assembled from shipping crates somewhere in Europe during the final months of the war. Dawn had not yet broken. Lantern light flickered across rows of carbines waiting for inspection before another jump. The air carried the scent of damp canvas, machine oil, and freshly cut pine. Around him, young soldiers quietly checked equipment, adjusted straps, and exchanged the calm smiles of men preparing for another demanding day. One nervous private approached holding the same folding stock carbine with worry written across his face. The stock had developed the slightest movement after repeated use, so small that almost nobody would have noticed it. Thomas remembered taking the rifle into his hands, rotating the hinge beneath the lantern, and making one tiny witness mark with the corner of a hardened steel punch. "If this line ever moves," he had told the young soldier with a reassuring smile, "you bring her back before she tells you in her own way." The private had laughed, thanking him before disappearing into the gathering morning light. The memory drifted gently away like fog lifting from an open field. Thomas blinked once and found himself standing once again beneath bright museum lights. The same witness mark remained exactly where he had placed it so many decades earlier. No one noticed the change in the old man's expression. It was not sadness. It was recognition. Like someone reading a familiar signature after a lifetime apart. Ethan stepped closer, studying Thomas with growing uncertainty. "You have seen that mark before," he said quietly. Thomas nodded. "I made it." The words landed without drama, almost too simple to believe. Mason let out a short laugh. "That is impossible. This rifle has passed through military depots, collectors, private estates, and museums for nearly 80 years. Thomas looked toward him with patient eyes. "Yes," he answered gently. "It has traveled much farther than I have." No one laughed after that. The room settled into an uneasy silence broken only by the faint ticking of an antique wall clock near the archive office. Noah lowered his gaze toward the tiny witness mark once more. The line looked insignificant, hardly larger than a grain of rice, yet suddenly it seemed to carry more weight than every digital report stacked on Ethan's desk. For the first time that morning, nobody was looking at the restoration equipment. Every eye in the room was fixed on the old veteran whose quiet memories appeared to fit the forgotten rifle more perfectly than any document preserved inside the museum's carefully guarded archives. Thomas carefully lifted the carbine from the padded cloth with both hands, supporting its weight as though it were still expected to serve another generation. He did not raise it high. He did not inspect it like a collector searching for flaws. Instead, he simply held it close enough to listen. His eyes closed for only a moment. The workshop remained silent. Ethan watched with folded arms, unsure whether he was witnessing genuine expertise or an old man's ritual shaped by memory. Thomas slowly opened his eyes and rested the rifle across the bench once more. "Everyone has been trying to repair the symptom," he said quietly. "The problem began long before any of you received it." Ethan stepped closer. "Then tell us what we missed." Thomas shook his head with a faint smile. "If I tell you, you will believe I guessed. If I show you, you will understand." He reached into the leather satchel and removed the small wooden-handled screwdriver. The tools showed decades of careful sharpening and polishing. Its steel shaft reflected the overhead lights with a soft glow rather than a bright shine. Mason could not help smiling again. "You cannot seriously think that old tool belongs anywhere near a museum artifact." Thomas looked at the screwdriver with quiet affection. "It has worked on more carbines than I can remember." Without another word, he loosened a single screw no more than a quarter turn. Ethan immediately leaned forward. "That screw has already been checked. Torque values are correct." Thomas nodded. "Exactly. Someone wanted it to be perfect." He gently rotated the folding stock until it stopped naturally. Then he looked beneath the hinge once more. There. Nobody else saw anything. Noah moved closer until he was almost beside Thomas. "I still do not understand." Thomas pointed to a hairline gap almost invisible beneath the hinge plate. "The stock is carrying tension that does not belong there." Ethan frowned. "That gap is less than the thickness of a sheet of paper." "It only needs to be," Thomas replied. "Steel remembers pressure even when people do not." The words settled over the room with unexpected weight. Thomas carefully lifted the hinge plate just enough to expose a narrow hidden surface. Decades of oil and dust had darkened the metal, but beneath the residue rested a faint circular impression no scanner had reported. Thomas smiled almost imperceptibly. "There you are." Noah stared at the tiny mark. "What is it?" Thomas ran one fingertip beside it without touching the metal itself. "A compression ring." Ethan's eyes narrowed. "There should not be one." "Not according to the drawings," Thomas answered. "But the drawings were updated after the war. The first production runs settled differently. We learned that in the field." Mason crossed his arms more tightly than before, yet he no longer looked amused. He looked uncertain. Thomas continued calmly. "Someone restored this rifle many years later using factory specifications instead of battlefield experience. Every adjustment afterward repeated the same mistake because everyone trusted the paperwork more than the rifle." Ethan slowly lowered his tablet onto the bench without realizing he had done so. The digital reports that had guided weeks of careful work suddenly felt incomplete. Noah looked from the hidden compression ring to the old veteran's face. "How could anyone possibly know that?" Thomas rested the screwdriver beside the leather satchel. His answer came almost as a whisper. "Because the manuals were written after the lessons were learned. Some of us were there before the pages existed." No one spoke. Even the steady ticking of the old wall clock seemed louder than before. For the first time since the restoration project had begun, the experts stopped looking at their instruments and started looking at the quiet man whose memories reached further back than every document stored inside the museum walls. No one reached for a scanner. No one opened another technical manual. The workshop had quietly shifted into unfamiliar territory where experience carried more weight than documentation. Thomas rested both hands on the edge of the workbench and looked at the old carbine with the calm expression of someone remembering a conversation interrupted decades ago. "The rifle is not asking to become new again," he said softly. "It only wants someone to stop forcing it to be something it never was." Ethan listened without interrupting. For the first time since the restoration project had begun, he was no longer defending his conclusions. He was trying to understand someone else's. Thomas picked up the small bottle of amber oil from his satchel and removed the cap. A faint scent drifted into the air, different from the modern synthetic lubricants arranged neatly across the laboratory shelves. Noah noticed it immediately. "That smells different." Thomas smiled. "It should. My father taught me how to mix it after I came home. It is close to what we used when supplies were difficult to find." He placed a single drop on the tip of a cotton cloth instead of directly onto the rifle. Every movement remained deliberate, measured, almost ceremonial. He gently cleaned the hidden surface beneath the folding hinge where decades of residue had settled. As the dark layer slowly lifted away, another tiny detail emerged from the steel. It was not a serial number. It was not an inspection stamp. It was a barely visible hand-etched line no machine could have produced with such quiet imperfection. Thomas stopped moving. His eyes rested on the mark, and a warm smile slowly crossed his face. "You kept it." Noah leaned closer. "Kept what?" Thomas traced the air above the tiny line without touching it. "A field adjustment." Ethan looked puzzled again. "That was intentional?" Thomas nodded. "Every rifle has small differences. During the early production runs we learned that a few needed tiny corrections to perform exactly as intended. Those corrections stayed with the rifle for life. They were never listed because every one was different." Mason looked toward the archive shelves lining the far wall. "There is nothing about that in the factory records." "There would not be," Thomas answered. "Factories built rifles. Soldiers learned their personalities." The sentence settled into the room with unexpected force. Noah quietly reached for his phone, not to record the old veteran but to search the museum archive catalog. He entered the rifle's serial number, hoping to find something overlooked. Hundreds of maintenance records appeared, stretching across decades, yet one notation near the earliest transfer report immediately caught his attention. The line was unusually brief. "Field modified before depot intake." No further explanation followed. Noah looked back toward Thomas with widening eyes. There really was a field modification. Ethan stepped beside him and silently read the same record. The notation had been sitting in the archive for years, dismissed because no one knew what it referred to. Thomas did not appear surprised. He simply folded the cotton cloth and returned it to his satchel. Paper remembers facts, he said quietly. Steel remembers hands. Ethan slowly removed his identification badge and set it beside the tablet on the workbench, an unconscious gesture that made him look less like the chief restoration specialist and more like a student standing before an old teacher. Outside the tall workshop windows, the afternoon sunlight shifted across the museum courtyard, casting long golden reflections through the glass until they rested gently across the weathered walnut stock. For one silent moment, it seemed as though the years between the workshop and another distant autumn had quietly disappeared, leaving only an old rifle and the last man alive who still understood the language it had been speaking all along. Thomas stood quietly beside the workbench while the others studied the newly discovered archive notation again and again, as though reading it often enough might somehow change what it said. It never did. The room had become remarkably still. Even the younger technicians who had quietly questioned him only minutes before now watched every movement without speaking. Thomas gently picked up the old carbine once more, supporting it naturally, never gripping it with unnecessary force. He adjusted the folding stock by only a fraction of an inch before setting it back onto the padded cloth. Ethan immediately noticed something unusual. "You did not replace a single part," he said. Thomas gave a slight shake of his head. "Nothing here needed replacing." Ethan looked down at the exposed hinge assembly. "Then what changed?" Thomas rested the wooden-handled screwdriver beside the rifle. "Pressure." The answer sounded almost too simple. Ethan frowned. "Pressure?" Thomas nodded. "Every restoration before today tried to remove resistance. They polished surfaces, tightened fasteners, corrected measurements, and chased factory tolerances. But no one asked why the rifle resisted those corrections." Noah stepped closer, fascinated. "So the problem was never corrosion?" Thomas smiled gently. "Corrosion was only what everyone could see. The real problem was that someone 80 years ago tried to make an experienced rifle behave like a brand new one." He slowly pointed toward the hidden compression ring beneath the hinge. "When that adjustment disappeared, every restoration afterward inherited the same mistake." Ethan leaned over the workbench, examining the tiny space with fresh eyes. For weeks he had trusted digital scans capable of measuring dimensions smaller than a human hair, yet none of those instruments had asked the question Thomas had asked within seconds of seeing the rifle. Mason quietly opened another engineering drawing before stopping halfway through. He lowered the document without another word. It suddenly felt incomplete. Thomas reached into his satchel one final time and removed a small strip of folded paper, yellowed by age. Carefully unfolding it, he revealed several handwritten measurements recorded in faded pencil. Noah looked surprised. "Are those original?" Thomas smiled. "No. They are reminders." Ethan looked closer. The numbers were not official specifications. They were observations. Tiny notes written beside simple sketches. "Hinge settles after." Repeated folding. "Allow natural seating before final adjustment." "Never tighten against memory." Ethan read the last sentence twice. "Never tighten against memory," he repeated quietly. Thomas nodded. "One of my instructors said that to me in 1944. He believed steel learned just as people did. At the time I thought he was only being poetic. Years later I realized he was teaching mechanics." Thomas carefully returned the folded paper to the satchel. Then, using nothing more than gentle finger pressure, he settled the hinge into its natural position before giving the screw less than an eighth of a turn. No special instrument confirmed the adjustment. No digital display flashed green. Yet something changed. The folding stock rested differently. The tiny hidden gap disappeared without force. Ethan slowly lifted the rifle and moved the stock through its full range of motion. It folded smoothly. It locked with a clean, confident click unlike anything the team had heard since the project began. Nobody celebrated. Nobody spoke. The sound itself seemed almost sacred inside the quiet workshop. Noah felt goosebumps rise along his arms. Ethan lowered the rifle with extraordinary care and looked toward Thomas with an expression completely different from the one he had worn that morning. It was no longer skepticism. It was respect mixed with a question he had not yet found the courage to ask. Across the room, unnoticed by everyone except Noah, an old black and white photograph hanging near the archive office caught the late afternoon sunlight. One young paratrooper stood near a workbench, smiling beside a row of freshly inspected carbines. Noah stared at the face in the photograph, then slowly turned toward Thomas, realizing they were looking at the same man separated only by the passage of 80 years. Noah walked slowly toward the framed photograph hanging near the archive office, unable to take his eyes off the young paratrooper standing beside the line of carbines. The resemblance was unmistakable. The same steady posture. The same calm expression. Even the slight tilt of the head matched the elderly man now standing only a few yards away. He looked back and forth twice before quietly removing the photograph from its hook. "Mr. Brooks," he called softly, careful not to disturb the silence that had settled over the workshop. Ethan turned and accepted the frame. His eyes narrowed as he compared the faded image with Thomas Walker. For several long seconds, nobody spoke. Then Ethan slowly looked up. "This photograph was taken in 1945. Thomas answered with a small nod. "That sounds about right." Noah felt a growing sense of disbelief. "Why is there no name on the display?" Thomas smiled gently. "Most mechanics were never photographed for history books." Noah carried the frame to the archive terminal and carefully typed the identification number printed on its label. The museum database opened a storage record connected to an unopened personnel file that had never been digitized because it belonged to a collection received decades earlier from a closed military warehouse. A single note appeared on the screen. "Original documents available in secure archive. Authorization required." Noah looked toward Ethan. Without hesitation, Ethan entered his supervisor credentials. A moment later, the archive inventory revealed a weathered personnel folder stored in a climate-controlled vault beneath the museum. Attached to the record was another notation that immediately caught Ethan's attention. "Technical Advisor, Airborne Ordnance Evaluation Team." Thomas quietly looked away, as though the words belonged to someone else. Ethan reached for the office telephone and dialed the internal archive extension. "This is Ethan Brooks. I need personnel file 47 Alpha removed from secure storage immediately." The archivist asked for the authorization reason. Ethan glanced toward Thomas before answering. "Historical verification." Several minutes later, the elevator doors opened and an elderly archivist carried a gray preservation box into the workshop. She placed it gently on the table and carefully lifted the lid. Inside rested neatly organized documents tied with faded cotton ribbon, several black and white photographs, and an official letter bearing the seal of the United States Army. Noah carefully unfolded the first photograph. It showed Thomas as a young soldier standing beside senior officers while inspecting airborne equipment before shipment overseas. Another image revealed rows of carbines spread across wooden benches with handwritten notes attached to each one. Ethan opened the official letter with gloved hands. His eyes moved silently across the page before stopping halfway. He read the next line again, slower this time. His expression changed completely. "This cannot be right," Mason whispered. Ethan looked up from the document. "It is." Noah stepped closer. "What does it say?" Ethan swallowed before reading aloud. "Special recognition for developing field maintenance procedures that significantly increased long-term operational reliability of airborne carbines during active service." The room fell silent once more. Thomas lowered his eyes toward the old rifle resting peacefully on the padded cloth. He did not look proud. He looked grateful that someone had finally opened a box that had been waiting quietly for many decades. Ethan carefully set the letter back into its protective sleeve and reached for his phone. There was only one person he believed should see what had just been uncovered. He searched through his contacts until he found the number he had not used in months. The name on the screen read Major General William Hawthorne, Chairman of the National Military Heritage Foundation. Ethan pressed the call button, never imagining that within the next hour the quiet workshop would receive a visitor whose arrival would change every person standing inside it. The workshop remained unusually quiet after Ethan ended the call. No one asked how long it would take. No one questioned whether the chairman of the National Military Heritage Foundation would actually come. They simply returned their attention to Thomas, who stood beside the workbench with the same quiet patience he had carried since walking through the museum doors. He did not seem interested in the personnel file or the photographs spread across the table. His eyes rested only on the old carbine. A few minutes later, the distant sound of tires rolling across the museum courtyard reached the workshop. Through the high windows, Noah glanced outside. A dark government sedan had stopped near the entrance. Two uniformed aides stepped out first before opening the rear passenger door. Major General William Hawthorne emerged with measured confidence, his service cap tucked beneath one arm. Museum staff who happened to be passing through the lobby instinctively straightened as he entered the building. The general acknowledged them with a polite nod but did not slow his pace. Within moments, the workshop door opened. Ethan stepped forward. "General Hawthorne, thank you for coming on such short notice." The general offered a brief handshake before looking across the room. His attention settled on the workbench, then on the weathered carbine, and finally on the elderly man standing quietly beside it. Everything else seemed to disappear. William Hawthorne took one slow step forward. Then another. His expression softened in a way none of the museum staff had ever seen. Thomas looked up with a faint smile. "It has been a long time, General." William stopped only a few feet away. A warm smile appeared beneath his silver hair. "Longer than either of us expected, Tom." No one in the room moved. Ethan blinked in surprise. The general crossed the remaining distance and extended both hands. Thomas accepted them with quiet warmth. There was no dramatic embrace. No loud celebration. Only the unmistakable respect shared between two men whose lives had once crossed in service many decades earlier. William looked toward the carbine resting on the bench. "They told me someone understood this rifle better than the archives did." Thomas chuckled softly. "The rifle has always been a better teacher than the paperwork." The general laughed, recognizing the familiar phrase immediately. "You still say that?" Ethan stood speechless. "General, you know Mr. Walker personally?" William turned toward the restoration team. "Personally? Every airborne armorer who served after the war studied procedures that began with Thomas Walker. Most never knew whose handwriting they were following." Silence settled over the room once again. Mason lowered his eyes, remembering every skeptical remark he had made earlier that afternoon. Noah looked toward the faded handwritten notes inside the preservation box with entirely new appreciation. William carefully picked up one of the old photographs from the table. It showed Thomas standing beside a row of carbines while several officers observed his work. The general smiled. "This picture hung outside my instructor's office when I was a young lieutenant. We were told that if we ever met the man in this photograph, we should listen more than we spoke." Ethan felt the weight of those words settle over him. Thomas simply shrugged with quiet humility. "Most people forgot the photograph." William gently returned it to the table. "Perhaps. But the people who learned from your work never forgot the lessons." He then turned toward the restored carbine, lifted it carefully into his hands, and cycled the folding stock once. A crisp, confident click echoed through the workshop. The general closed his eyes for a brief moment before looking back at Thomas. "Welcome home, my old friend. History has been waiting for you longer than any of us realized." The last rays of afternoon sunlight settled across the workshop as if they had been waiting for this moment all along. Major General William Hawthorne carefully placed the restored carbine back onto the padded cloth with both hands, giving it the same respect he had shown Thomas Walker. No one spoke. The silence felt complete, not because there was nothing left to say, but because every important truth had finally found its place. Ethan stepped forward and looked at Thomas with a humility that had replaced every trace of certainty he carried earlier that morning. "I owe you an apology," he said quietly. "I believed every answer was already inside our equipment and our records. I forgot that sometimes the most important knowledge is carried by the people who lived the history." Thomas smiled with the same gentle expression that had never changed throughout the day. "We all learn that sooner or later." Ethan lowered his head for a brief moment before extending his hand. Thomas accepted it without hesitation. There was no victory in his eyes. Only kindness. Noah carefully lifted the small brass plaque that had been engraved with the words "non-restorable." He looked at it for several seconds before turning toward Ethan. "What should we do with this?" Ethan accepted the plaque, studied it, then quietly placed it into a storage drawer. "It does not belong with this rifle anymore." The young volunteer nodded, then reached for a blank museum label instead. He hesitated before writing a single sentence across the top in careful block letters. "Restored through original field knowledge provided by Thomas Walker." Ethan looked at the wording and smiled. "Add one more line." Noah looked up. Ethan spoke softly. "Preserved not only by steel, but by memory." Noah carefully wrote the additional sentence beneath the first. Major General Hawthorne read the finished label and nodded with quiet approval. "That is how history should be remembered." Thomas gently closed the worn leather satchel that had traveled beside him for so many years. The brass clasp clicked shut with the same familiar sound everyone in the room had come to recognize. He slipped the strap over his shoulder and looked once more at the old carbine. It rested peacefully beneath the workshop lights, no longer waiting for someone to understand it. Before turning toward the door, Thomas reached out and lightly touched the walnut stock with 2 fingertips. "Take good care of her," he whispered. "She has already served her country well." William walked beside him toward the exit. At the doorway, the general stopped and slowly raised his hand in a quiet salute. Thomas looked surprised for only an instant before returning the salute with calm dignity. No command had been given. No ceremony had been planned. Yet everyone inside the workshop instinctively stood a little straighter. Ethan placed his hand over his heart. Noah did the same. Even Mason, who had questioned Thomas from the very beginning, silently removed his identification badge and held it respectfully against his chest. Thomas lowered his hand first. "Thank you," he said simply. Then he stepped into the golden evening light without looking back. Through the tall windows, Noah watched the elderly veteran walk across the museum courtyard, carrying nothing more than his weathered leather satchel. The setting sun stretched his shadow across the brick path until it blended with the long shadows of the memorial statues standing nearby, making it almost impossible to tell where living memory ended and history began. Inside the workshop, the restored carbine rested beneath its new display label, no longer remembered as a forgotten relic, but as a quiet witness to the hands that had once cared for it. And everyone who had stood in that room understood something they would never again find inside a manual or a machine. Some lessons are written on paper. The most enduring ones are written in character, remembered in silence, and passed from one generation to the next.